John thought he knew everything about his life, 60 years of love, trust, and family. But one evening, a single confession from his beloved wife shattered everything he believed to be true. What she revealed will leave you speechless. Stay with us until the end to uncover the truth that changed everything. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed the Wilsons' modest home in a warm, golden light. The house, surrounded by a neatly trimmed garden full of blooming flowers, stood as a living testament to 60 years of love, patience, and unwavering commitment. Inside, the aroma of freshly brewed tea lingered in the air. The dining table, old but well kept, held 2 cups of tea, one for John Wilson and one for his beloved wife, Martha. They sat across from each other, their gazes meeting in a shared moment of quiet reflection. John, a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a face lined with the marks of time, leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Martha with an affectionate gaze. 60 years, Martha, he said, his voice deep but gentle. Can you believe it? After all this time, here we are, still side by side. Martha smiled, her dark skin glowing softly in the evening light. Despite the frailty that age had brought, she still possessed an elegance that had captivated John all those decades ago. Her hands, slightly trembling, rested on her lap. She glanced out the window, watching the sun dip lower behind the horizon. 60 years, she repeated, her smile faint but sincere. We've been through it all, haven't we? John nodded, his eyes narrowing with a mix of pride and nostalgia. We sure have, he said, leaning forward, his hands resting on the edge of the table. The kids, the grandkids, all of them turned out all right because of you, Martha. You're the heart of this family. You always have been. Martha's smile faltered. Her gaze dropped to her lap, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. She pulled her hands together tightly, her breathing slowing. John noticed it right away. The shift in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His brows furrowed with concern. Martha? He asked, tilting his head slightly, his voice filled with gentle worry. You all right? Silence. She didn't answer at first. Her eyes stayed on her hands as if they held the weight of a memory too heavy to lift. She opened her mouth, closed it, then took a shallow breath. Her chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately. John, she said softly, her voice unsteady like the crack of old wood under pressure. There's something I need to tell you. John sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing with concern. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. What is it, Martha? You're scaring me. She shook her head slowly, her eyes glistening as tears began to well up. I should have told you a long time ago, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I should have, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to do it. John's chest tightened. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, folding her arms protectively over her lap. Her tears fell freely now, and she bit her lower lip, trying to hold in a sob. His heart began to pound harder. Martha, he said firmly, his voice more serious now, you know you can tell me anything. Whatever it is, we'll face it together, just like we always have. She shook her head again, squeezing her eyes shut, letting the tears flow down her cheeks. Not this, John, she said, her voice cracking. Not this. A cold chill swept over him. The warmth of the golden sunlight that had filled the room only moments ago seemed to fade into a hollow, empty gray. Martha, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. Tell me. Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes locked on the table. Then, slowly, she raised her gaze to meet his. Her voice, quiet and broken, carried the weight of 60 years of silence. While you were working in Detroit, while you were away, I made a mistake, John. His eyes blinked slowly, his face frozen in confusion. A mistake? He repeated, his mind unable to process the words at first. Her hands shook violently now, and her breathing grew more ragged. I was lonely, John. So lonely, she said, her face crumpling under the weight of her guilt. And I let myself fall into something I shouldn't have. Her words hung in the air like the crack of thunder before a storm. John sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening. What are you saying, Martha? Her eyes filled with raw, unfiltered pain. Her lips quivered as she spoke the words that had haunted her for 6 long decades. I was with another man, John, just once. But it happened. Her voice broke into sobs. And I got pregnant. John's face hardened like stone. His eyes, so full of warmth just minutes ago, turned cold and distant. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just stared at her. Her sobs grew louder. I was scared, John. I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell you. I knew it would destroy you. It would destroy us. Her voice cracked, and she gasped for air, unable to contain her grief. So, I had the baby, a boy. I gave him up for adoption. The silence in the room was deafening. No birds chirping outside, no creaks of the floorboards, only the sound of Martha's quiet sobbing. John's hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His breathing grew shallow and sharp, like a man drowning just below the surface of water. His mind was spinning, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. You... His voice was hollow, distant. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. You had a child, and you didn't tell me? Martha nodded slowly, her eyes filled with regret. Yes, she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. I thought it was the only way to protect you, to protect us. Protect me? His voice rose suddenly, sharp like broken glass. His eyes, usually filled with kindness, were now wild with disbelief and anger. You call that protecting me, Martha? He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. She flinched, wiping tears from her face. John, please. Please understand, I was so young, so scared. I didn't know what else to do. Don't, he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. Don't give me excuses, Martha. 60 years. 60 years you let me live a lie. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something to focus on, something to ground him, but nothing helped. We had a son, and you threw him away like he was nothing. Her face contorted with pain. No, I didn't throw him away, John, she cried, her voice filled with anguish. I thought I was doing what was best for him, for us. John turned away from her, his hands on his hips, his breathing shallow and fast. He paced the room, his heart racing. His eyes darted back to her, filled with betrayal, sadness, and something darker, something she hadn't seen in him before. You stole a life from me, Martha, a whole life. His voice shook with emotion. I know, she said, her voice breaking. She pressed her hands to her chest like she was trying to hold her heart together. I know I did, and I'll never forgive myself for it. That's why I'm telling you now, John. I'm telling you because I don't want to die with this secret. You deserve to know. John's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. His face was a storm of pain, rage, and exhaustion. He stared at her like she was a stranger. For the first time in 60 years, she didn't feel like his Martha. He took a slow, deliberate step back from her. I need to get out of here, he muttered. I need air. He turned, walking toward the door. "John, please," she begged, her voice desperate. "Don't leave me like this." He stopped, his hand resting on the doorknob. He didn't turn around. He didn't speak. His shoulders rose and fell with a heavy breath. Then, without a word, he opened the door and stepped outside, letting the cool evening air wash over him. Behind him, he heard Martha's quiet sobbing echoing through the house. For the first time in 60 years, it didn't feel like home. The morning sun seeped through the thin curtains, casting streaks of pale gold across the bedroom wall. John lay on his side, eyes open, fixed on the empty space in the bed where Martha should have been. Her absence weighed heavier than the blankets draped over him. For the first time in his life, the silence of the house felt oppressive, almost suffocating. His heart still ached with the weight of the truth she had revealed the night before. The word betrayal echoed in his mind like a stubborn drumbeat that wouldn't stop. Slowly, he sat up, his joints cracking as his feet touched the cold wooden floor. His eyes, red from lack of sleep, stared blankly ahead as he tried to piece together the reality he now faced. 60 years. 60 years, and she had hidden something so monumental from him. His throat felt dry, and no amount of swallowing could ease the discomfort. Downstairs, the faint clinking of dishes could be heard. Martha was up, moving slowly but deliberately, the way she always did in the mornings. John rubbed his face with his hands and sighed deeply before pushing himself off the bed. His steps were heavy, each one feeling like an effort as he descended the stairs. When he reached the kitchen, he saw her. She was seated at the small breakfast table, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. Her eyes were downcast, her shoulders slouched as if the weight of the previous night's confession had drained her spirit. The air between them was thick, but not with the warmth it once carried. John stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on her. Her hands trembled slightly as she brought the cup to her lips. He knew she felt him watching her, but she didn't look up. His jaw tightened as he stepped forward, pulling a chair away from the table. The loud scrape of wood on the floor made her flinch. He sat across from her, hands resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving her face. She finally raised her gaze to meet his, her eyes puffy from crying, but still filled with a quiet strength. "I'm going to find him," John said flatly, his voice low but firm. Her eyes widened, her lips parting slightly. "I'm going to find our son," he repeated, more certain this time. Martha set the teacup down slowly, her gaze flickering with a mixture of fear and hope. "John," she whispered, shaking her head, "you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," he replied quickly, cutting her off. "You might have been able to live with it, but I can't. I can't sit here and act like he doesn't exist." His voice grew sharper with each word. "I won't do it, Martha. Not anymore." Her hands clutched the edge of the table, her breathing unsteady. "And then what, John?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you plan to do when you find him? You think he's just going to open his arms and call you Dad? He's lived a whole life without us." "I don't know," John admitted, his voice quieter but no less determined. "But I need to know him, Martha. I deserve that much." Silence fell between them, heavy and unmoving. Martha blinked back fresh tears but didn't speak. She just nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a tight line. She understood there was no stopping him. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "If you do find him," she said softly, "be kind. Please, John, be kind." He didn't respond. He just stood, grabbed his coat from the hook near the door, and left without another word. The door shut behind him with a soft thud, But to Martha, it sounded like the end of something much greater. John drove to the library in silence, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. The radio was off. He didn't want music. He didn't want voices. All he wanted was quiet, but even that was filled with the echoes of Martha's confession. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts: love, betrayal, anger, and above all, a deep, unrelenting need to understand. As he pulled into the parking lot, he sat in the car for a moment, his eyes closed, his head resting on the back of the seat. When he finally stepped inside, the cool, dry air of the library greeted him. Rows upon rows of books stretched out before him like an endless maze. The smell of old paper and ink hung in the air. It was quiet except for the soft tapping of fingers on keyboards from the public computer area. John approached the front desk, where a woman with sharp eyes and a kind smile greeted him. Her name tag read Linda. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "I'm looking for old adoption records," John said, glancing down at the desk. "Or maybe something that can help me track down someone from a long time ago." Her expression shifted from polite curiosity to quiet understanding. "We don't have direct access to adoption records," she explained, "but you might be able to find something in public archives, newspaper mentions, school directories, that sort of thing." John nodded slowly. "I'll take whatever I can get." Linda pointed him toward the microfilm machines in the far corner of the library. It had been decades since John had seen one, but he remembered how they worked. He spent the next few hours scanning old newspaper articles, his eyes growing tired from the flickering images on the screen. He clicked through page after page of old articles, his patience wearing thin. The hours dragged on until, finally, a small headline caught his eye: "Local Teen Wins Science Fair." It was a small piece from 1978, buried in the corner of the page. The name Michael Reynolds jumped out at him, his breath hitched in his throat. His eyes darted across the article, taking in every detail. The boy had been 14, attending a school in Chicago. He'd been adopted by Richard and Angela Reynolds. John's fingers hovered over the screen, his eyes burning with exhaustion, but he didn't blink. This was it. It had to be. Heart pounding, he quickly scribbled down the name, school, and year in his notebook. He sat back in his chair, staring at the name Michael Reynolds on the page. This wasn't just a name anymore. This was a person, a life, his son. He returned home that night carrying his notebook and a growing sense of purpose. The air was cool, the stars just beginning to peek out from the evening sky. When he walked through the front door, Martha was sitting on the couch, a blanket draped over her lap. Her eyes flickered to him briefly, then back to the TV. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I found something," John finally said, his voice soft but certain. He held up his notebook, waving it lightly in the air. "His name is Michael Reynolds. He's in Chicago." Martha's eyes widened, her lips parting in silent shock. She sat up straighter, her hand pressed against her chest as if she were steadying her heart. "Chicago?" she repeated, barely above a whisper. "Yeah," John said, moving to the kitchen table. He dropped his notebook on the table, flipping it open to the page with his notes. "I found a newspaper article from 1978. He won some science fair. His adopted parents are named Richard and Angela Reynolds." Martha's eyes were fixed on the page, her fingers twitching on the armrest of her chair. Her breathing grew slow and shallow. "He's a grown man now," she said, her voice distant, almost dreamlike. "He's probably got a family of his own." "Maybe," John replied, still staring at the name on the page as if it might come to life. "But I'm going to find him, Martha. I have to." Her eyes locked with his. There was no fear in them now, only quiet acceptance. "Then find him," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Find him and tell him the truth." John nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I will." The next morning, John called a friend from church who had experience in genealogy research. They spent hours looking through public databases and social media profiles. Slowly, a clearer picture began to form. "Here," the friend said, pointing to the screen. "Michael Reynolds, architect, lives in Chicago. Wife, 2 kids." John leaned forward, his heart racing. He stared at the image on the screen, a photo of a man in his 40s, smiling, arms around his family. John's breath caught in his chest. His son. "I'm going to Chicago," John said, his eyes still locked on the screen. "I'm going to see him with my own eyes." He grabbed his coat, heart pounding with every step toward the door. The streets of Chicago buzzed with life. Cars honked impatiently. People hurried down sidewalks with coffee cups in hand, and distant sirens echoed through the towering buildings. John sat in his car, parked across the street from the sleek, glass-walled office building where he knew Michael Reynolds worked. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat feeling heavier than the last. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His eyes never left the building's entrance, scanning every person who walked in or out. His breath was shallow, his nerves frayed. "Come on, John," he muttered to himself. "You've come this far. No turning back now." His eyes suddenly locked on a figure emerging from the building, a tall, broad-shouldered man with smooth, confident movements. He wore a gray suit that fit him perfectly, his stride steady and assured. John's breath caught in his throat. There was no doubt in his mind. It was him, Michael Reynolds, his son. John stared, his eyes darting across Michael's features, the sharp jawline, the slight curve of his brow, and the way he tilted his head as he spoke to a coworker beside him. He recognized himself in those features. It was like looking at a reflection of his younger self. A flood of emotions hit him all at once. Pride, sadness, fear. This was his son. A man who had built a life of his own, a life that John had never been a part of. His heart ached. He could have had this. He could have seen him grow up, seen him win that science fair, seen him graduate. He could have been there for it all, but he hadn't been. That chance had been stolen from him. His grip on the steering wheel tightened even more as his mind filled with memories of Martha's confession. He shook his head, pushing those thoughts away. This wasn't the time to be angry. Taking a deep breath, John opened the car door. His heart thudded in his chest, his hands damp with sweat. He crossed the street slowly, eyes focused on Michael, who had just walked toward a small cafe on the corner. People moved around John as if he didn't exist. His legs felt like lead, every step heavier than the last. He reached the cafe door just as Michael was placing his order at the counter. John hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. He could leave right now, get back in his car, drive away, pretend he'd never come. But something inside him, something stronger than fear, pushed him forward. His hand gripped the handle, pulled it open, and he stepped inside. The cafe smelled of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked pastries. The hum of conversation filled the air, but John heard none of it. His focus was on Michael, who now sat at a small table by the window, sipping his coffee, his eyes scanning his phone. John approached slowly, heart hammering in his chest. His mouth was dry. "Excuse me," John said, his voice cracking slightly. Michael looked up, his eyebrows raised in polite confusion. "Do you mind if I sit here for a moment?" Michael tilted his head, his eyes narrowing with slight suspicion. Sure," he said cautiously, motioning to the chair across from him. John pulled out the chair and sat down, his hands resting on the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Michael glanced at his phone, clearly unsure of what this older man wanted from him. John took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you," John began, his voice low but steady. I came a long way to see you." Michael set his phone down, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "See me?" he asked, folding his hands together. "Do I know you?" John licked his lips, his gaze fixed on Michael's face. "No," he said slowly, his eyes soft but filled with quiet intensity. "No, you don't know me. But I know you, Michael." Michael's brows furrowed deeper. He leaned forward slightly, his posture shifting from casual to alert. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his tone sharper now, more guarded. John leaned forward too, his heart pounding harder than ever. "Because I've been looking for you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "For weeks. Ever since I found out about you." Michael sat back in his chair, confusion and suspicion clear on his face. "All right. I'm going to need you to be a little more specific, old man," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "What do you mean you've been looking for me?" John felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He took a slow, deep breath and looked Michael directly in the eyes. "I'm your father, Michael," he said, his voice steady but filled with pain. "Your biological father." Silence. The cafe's background noise seemed to fade away into nothing. Michael didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared, his face frozen in a mask of disbelief. His eyes slowly blinked, like his brain was struggling to process what he had just heard. Then, suddenly, he laughed. It was short, sharp, and bitter. "You're joking," Michael said, shaking his head, his eyes hard. "This is some kind of joke." John reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. He carefully slid it across the table toward Michael. "It's not a joke," John said softly. "These are the documents. Birth certificate, adoption records, even a letter from your mother." His throat tightened at the word, but he pushed through it. "Take a look." Michael glanced down at the envelope, his jaw clenched. His hands hovered over it for a moment before he grabbed it and opened it slowly. His eyes scanned the birth certificate first, his brows furrowing as he read his name, his birth date, and his biological parents' names: John Wilson and Martha Wilson. His breathing grew shallow as he flipped through the adoption papers, his fingers tightening on the edges. His eyes landed on the letter, and he recognized the delicate, familiar handwriting. His lips pressed into a thin line as he read it. Slowly, he folded the papers and placed them back on the table. His gaze lifted to meet John's, his eyes now filled with something more than suspicion. There was anger there, yes, but also confusion, pain, and something deeper. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "I don't expect anything," John replied calmly. "I just wanted you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you." Michael sat back in his chair, his arms crossed, his eyes locked on John's face. For a long, painful moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe buzzed around them as people moved in and out, ordering drinks, laughing, living their lives. But for John and Michael, the world had shrunk to the size of that small table. Finally, Michael leaned forward, his eyes sharp and cold. "Why now?" he asked, his voice quiet but full of heat. "Why after all these years?" John's shoulders slumped, his face heavy with the weight of the truth. "Because I didn't know," he said honestly. "Your mother, she kept it from me. She was scared, thought she was protecting me, protecting you." He let out a breath and rubbed his face with his hands. "I didn't know, Michael. Not until recently." Michael's face hardened again. "She lied to both of us then," he said bitterly, shaking his head. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No," John admitted. "It doesn't make it better, but it's the truth." Michael let out a hollow, bitter laugh. 60 years, he muttered. 60 years, and you show up now?" He shook his head, shoving the envelope back across the table. "I don't need this." John reached for the envelope but didn't open it. "I know," he said quietly, "but I needed it. I needed to see you, Michael, to know you." He leaned forward, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not here to disrupt your life. I just wanted you to know the truth." Michael sat silently, his eyes locked on John. Slowly, his gaze softened and he let out a long. His fingers drummed against the table. "Give me time," Michael said finally, his voice calmer now. "I need time to think." John nodded, his eyes glistening with quiet relief. "Take all the time you need, son," he said softly. Michael stood, pushing his chair back. "I'll call you," he muttered, sliding the papers into his coat pocket. "Don't expect much." John nodded again, watching as Michael walked toward the door. His son, his boy, a piece of himself walking away. But for the first time in days, John didn't feel despair. He felt hope. The days that followed were some of the longest in John's life. The quiet of his house, once a comfort, now felt like a hollow void. Every sound echoed louder than it should have. The ticking of the old wall clock was unbearable. The creak of the floorboards beneath his feet seemed sharper. Even the rustle of the newspaper he tried to read felt like thunder in his ears. His mind was too restless to focus on anything. His thoughts circled around Michael. His son. His boy. A man who had lived an entire life without knowing his true father. John spent most of his time in the garden, trimming the hedges and pulling weeds with more aggression than necessary. His hands ached from gripping the shears too tightly, but he didn't care. It was better than sitting in the house, staring at the phone, hoping it would ring. Every vibration of his cell phone made his heart leap in his chest, only to be disappointed by a spam call or a reminder about a doctor's appointment. The weight was unbearable, but he told himself he deserved it. After all, hadn't Michael waited a lifetime for answers? Martha watched him from the window. Her frail frame was wrapped in a soft blanket as she sat in her favorite chair by the living room window. She could see it in his face, the anxiety, the uncertainty, and the hope he refused to admit out loud. She didn't press him about it. She knew better. Some burdens a man must carry alone. On the 5th day after his meeting with Michael, John was sitting on the porch, his eyes half closed, letting the sun warm his face. The world seemed still, except for the distant chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then it happened. The phone buzzed in his pocket. His eyes shot open. For a moment, he sat there, frozen, afraid to hope. His hands moved slowly, trembling as he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the phone and stared at the screen. Michael. His heart thudded in his chest. His thumb hovered over the answer button, his breath shallow and quick. He pressed it and raised the phone to his ear. "Hello?" he said, his voice tight with restraint. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then Michael's voice came through, steady but quieter than before. "John," Michael said slowly, "I've been thinking." John closed his eyes, his head tilting back against the porch railing. Relief and nerves washed over him at once. "Yeah," he replied, his voice almost a whisper. "Me too." Another pause, then Michael said, "I want to meet again, somewhere quieter this time." John sat up, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. "Absolutely," he said quickly, "whenever, wherever you want." "Tomorrow," Michael replied. "There's a park not far from where I live. It's quiet, peaceful." "Name the time, and I'll be there," John said, gripping the phone tighter. 12 noon, Michael said. "Don't be late." John smiled softly, his eyes stinging as a tear slipped down his cheek. "I won't be." The call ended, but John sat there for a long time, clutching the phone, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. This was it. This was the moment he had prayed for. The next morning, he woke up early, earlier than usual. He picked out his best clothes, a clean, pressed button-down shirt and his nicest pair of slacks. He brushed his hair, smoothed his beard, and even shined his old leather shoes. Martha watched him from her chair, a small, knowing smile on her face. "You look good, John," she said quietly, her eyes soft with pride. He glanced at her, his eyes filled with that same quiet strength he'd always carried. "I have to," he replied. "I want him to see me the way I should have been." Her smile faded for a moment, and she reached out a hand toward him. He stepped over and took it, his fingers wrapping gently around hers. She gave his hand a squeeze, her eyes filled with a love so deep it could drown them both. "You'll do just fine," she whispered. John squeezed her hand back, then released it. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't have to. She knew where he was going. The drive to Chicago felt longer than it had the first time. His mind was quieter, more focused, but every mile was another heartbeat of doubt. Would Michael show up? Would he change his mind? Would it all fall apart? But he didn't let himself dwell on those thoughts for long. He had made it this far. There was no turning back now. When he reached the park, he saw it right away. It was peaceful, just as Michael had said. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling like soft whispers. Children played in the distance. Joggers moved along the path. It was calm, steady, everything he needed it to be. He spotted Michael before Michael spotted him. His son sat on a bench, his leather satchel at his side, his eyes gazing out at the lake in front of him. John took a breath, wiped his palms on his pants, and walked forward. He moved slowly, giving himself time to prepare for whatever came next. "Michael," he said softly as he approached. Michael turned his head, saw him, and nodded. "John," he replied. John sat down on the bench beside him, his hands resting on his knees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They both watched the lake, watched the gentle ripples move across the water. "I'm glad you came," John said after a while, his voice low but sincere. "I almost didn't," Michael admitted, his eyes still on the water. "But I figured I'd regret it if I didn't." John nodded slowly. "Regret's a heavy thing to carry," he said, glancing at Michael. "I know that more than most." Michael finally turned his head to look at him, his eyes sharp but no longer filled with anger. "I've got questions," he said plainly, "a lot of them." "Then ask," John said, his voice unwavering. "I'll answer every one." They talked for what felt like hours. Michael asked about Martha, about her decision, about John's life. John told him everything, The pain, the confusion, the love that never wavered despite everything. He told him about the nights he lay awake, wondering if he could have done something different. Michael listened, his eyes never leaving John's face. By the end of it, Michael leaned back on the bench, letting out a long, slow breath. He rubbed his hands together, his eyes distant but thoughtful. "You're not what I expected," Michael admitted, glancing at him. John raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" Michael smiled faintly. "Honestly, I don't know, but it wasn't you." John chuckled softly, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "Well, I'm not perfect, far from it." Michael nodded. "None of us are." They sat in silence again, but this time it was different. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't tense. It felt peaceful, like the first quiet moment after a long storm. "Do you want to meet them?" Michael asked suddenly, his eyes glancing at John. John blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "Them? My family," Michael clarified. "My wife, my kids. You should meet them." John's eyes burned, his throat tight. He nodded slowly, too overwhelmed to speak. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like that very much." They stood together, side by side, watching the sun begin its slow descent in the sky. The warmth of it brushed against their skin, and for the first time in a long time, John didn't feel so cold. He glanced at Michael, and Michael glanced back at him. "Thank you for giving me a chance," John said softly. Michael smirked, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Thank you for showing up." They walked back toward the entrance of the park together. Their steps, once out of sync, now moved in unison. Two men, two strangers once connected by blood, but now bound by something stronger. Family. That night, John called Martha. Her voice was weaker than usual, but it still carried warmth. "Did he come?" she asked softly. John smiled, his eyes closing as he leaned against the wall of his bedroom. "Yeah, Martha," he said, his voice filled with a quiet joy he hadn't felt in a long time. "He came." And for the first time in years, John slept peacefully. The past was behind him, but the future, for once, looked brighter than it had in a long, long time. And that's how a single truth hidden for decades changed everything. Life is unpredictable, but sometimes even the deepest wounds can heal with time and understanding. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one.